Hello, everyone, and welcome to this SIGA Sport Integrity event, Raising the Bar in Support of Youth Sport Coaches. This event tonight is facilitated by the United States Center for Coaching Excellence. I'm Kristen Diefenbach, the president, and I'll be moderating this with our excellent panelists that we have for today. Allison Vox-Bierke from the United States Department of Health and Human Services, Wayne Moss from the National Council of Youth Sports, Katie Hanna from the U.S. Center for Safe Sports, Jennifer Royer from True Sport and Awareness from the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency, and Lori Gaina Overway from the U.S. CCE, the Accreditation Chair, and also James Madison University. And we're really excited to put this panel together today and have this conversation around how do we raise the bar in support of our youth sport coaches, knowing that youth sport is touted as being very, very beneficial for kids. There's lots of great research about the creativity, the health and well-being, the social development, positive youth development that can happen through quality youth sport, and that quality being sort of hinging on the nature of the way the sport organizations are run, but also we've got some nice research to support the need for quality coaches that really make or break those experiences for our young people. And so as we think about that in that wide continuum of youth sport, all the way from what we could sometimes maybe talk about college prep or high performance youth sport, all the way through sport for underserved communities to support and enrich children's lives. And we think about the vast amount of money that is put into youth sport across the continuum. And we also think about the fact that there's a pay for play model all the way through programs that are offered from a social service perspective. There is a high reliance on youth sport volunteers in all of those systems. And the fact that youth sport volunteers are a critical piece of making these programs happen. In many places, if they don't have volunteers, they don't happen. And the need for, like I said, quality youth sport volunteers. And how do we start to think about that? Also, as we acknowledge the fact that there are concerns, not just that youth sport coaches might turn kids off from sport if the sport isn't up to a certain level of quality, but also, of course, our safety concerns for our children. So we brought this panel together today to talk a little bit about how can programs and organizations raise the bar to support youth sport coaching models, and we're going to explore that. So I'm going to kick it off with the first question for our panel of what should the expectations be of youth sport coaches collectively and individually? And I'm going to kick it off with Wayne Moss from the National Council of Youth Sports.
Well, thank you. You know, it's funny because the first place I go, which is probably the lowest bar, which is, you know, almost being like a doctor, you know, do no harm. You know, seriously, you know, when I think about youth sport coaches, you know, like the things that I think about is they should really be there to, you know, first and foremost, ensure that young people are being instilled with the love of the game, you know, that young people are having fun, having a good time, learning things along the way, not just on the skill development side, but also some of those softer skills. So, you know, at the very minimum, you know, those are some of the kinds of things that I think, you know, coaches and organizations should be thinking about.
Wonderful. Jennifer, would you like to add a little bit to that?
Yeah, I was jumping at the bit to get onto that one. I think Wayne hit the nail on the head here with really instilling a love for healthy activity, for allowing young people to have fun and to learn and develop confidence over time. And at least from our perspective, while that does happen through the skills and drills portion of youth sport, but it also happens from those soft skills, as Wayne mentioned. We feel really strongly that the life lessons that you learn through sport, competing the right way, not placing winning, although we certainly think healthy competition is a great value and it's certainly a worthy pursuit, but it's not at the expense of the health and happiness and well-being of the child. It's certainly not at the expense of their sense of right and wrong. It shouldn't ever compromise their value system. And so we want to make sure that we're balancing winning and those life skills, because we think that that both have some value. We truly believe that systemically, if we can get to a place where winning is still important in sport, but it's not the be-all, end-all, then we're creating better humans on the other side, not just great athletes, but great people. And from our perspective, that's definitely important. I think I'd like to add to that as well. Collectively, we'd love to see coaches begin to abide by some universally accepted coaching practices. I think having some standards in place, which is notably absent at this moment, I think would allow us the space to really have these conversations, even with those overtaxed volunteer coaches. I mean, I think any of us who've been connected to youth sport have probably either had at least one game where you're uncomfortably coaching in a volunteer capacity. Just because I happened to be the only one who didn't show up at the parent meeting, I got voluntold, right? And so we've all been in a position like that, and really giving those volunteer coaches all the resources that they need, and having a set of standards that we can all agree to, gives them a baseline, and I think that's really important.
Fantastic. Katie, from the U.S. Center for Safe Sports, do you want to jump in from your organizational perspective?
Great. Yeah, thank you, Kristen. And like the other speakers have talked about, I mean, we know that coaches play such a critical role in the lives of athletes. They can be a trusted adult in a child's life to help intervene in other situations, report abuse that's disclosed to them even off the field. And so, we know that at the U.S. Center for Safe Sport, sport can provide an environment where athletes feel safe, supported, and strengthened through their sport. And so, we want to make sure that coaches have the tools that they need to feel successful. And so, we've provided some resources I'll talk about a little bit later, but certainly being that trusted adult that can be a key player in that child's life, to help get them linked up with other supports that they may need, and making sure, I think as Jennifer said, that they've got the resources that they need through training, appropriate screening protocols, and following the policies that are put in place.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Can I just say one quick thing about that? The point that you just made is so important. I just want to underscore that the relationship between an athlete, a youth athlete, and that adult is paramount. The experience that young person will have will be based on that relationship, and in a lot of ways, it will determine whether or not the young people if that person wants to continue to participate in sport or not. And so, again, that relationship, I think, is really key. And, again, one of the things that we should all be thinking about is how do we support coaches in a way that they can then engage young people in a way that'll make a difference for them.
Wayne, thank you. And I think that really lends really well to sort of turning in and maybe getting Allison to weigh in a little bit, of course, coming from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and the President's Council on Sport, Fitness, and Nutrition, their National Youth Sports Strategy that just came out last November. And I'd love to hear sort of from that perspective.
Yeah, so one of the pillars in the executive order that sort of spurred the development of the National Youth Sports Strategy was around volunteerism. And so we actually have a lot of opportunities and action items and content in the National Youth Sports Strategy around training, recruitment, retention of volunteer coaches, officials, and other adults in the youth sport sphere. And just everybody's already spoken to many of those pieces. But in addition to teaching the sport itself and the life skills, creating that welcoming, inclusive climate, modeling good sporting behavior, not only, in the game, but with other parents, caregivers, coaches, officials, volunteers, and the youth themselves, I think is really important as well. And we also, speaking of the President's Council on Sports, Fitness, and Nutrition, we've recently reinstated the Science Board Subcommittee, and they are coming out with a report during the September 17th annual council meeting on the science of youth sports to supplement the National Youth Sports Strategy. And they have a whole chapter on parenting, coaching, and mentoring youth. So some of those highlights are treating sports as education, so teaching youth not only about the sports skills, but about behaviors that enhance their physical, mental, and emotional health, teaching inclusivity, focusing on balance, so encouraging not only other sport participations for that sport sampling, but in informal or pickup activities as well, and then rewarding outcomes that reflect the values. So aligning adults' goals, which sometimes, we get focused on what is rewarding for us, winning, and the performance aspect, aligning those goals with the outcomes that you value. So having fun, making social connection. So it might seem like a lot to put on the shoulders of these volunteers, but I think a lot of really remarkable people are taking up this charge and volunteering, and they have their heart in the right place. So how do we support them to really be those role models?
Awesome. And it actually leads really well, perhaps, to Lori, if you could speak a little bit. I know from the accreditation chair perspective, you know, there's the national standards for sport coaches from Shape America, and there's some guidelines or some information out there to help in this space.
Yeah, and so first, here with what everybody has said so far. I mean, I really think that the role of the coach, and if we were to set an expectation, is to really create an enjoyable and a developmental experience so young people can grow and thrive. And that's what the role of the coach is to do, is to really help them embrace being physically active and love being physically active so that they will do so for the rest of their lives, and that they will engage in sport, not only participating, but also from the sidelines and being that fan. And so how can coaches do that? And so one of the things that I think can help with that is the National Standards for Sport Coaches that was set by Shape America, where they lay out the 7 core responsibilities of sport coaches. And so the first being creating an athlete-centered coaching philosophy that really puts the athletes first. And so, as Allison talked about, is centering the athlete in regards to that, but also engaging in ethical practices. And so following an appropriate code of conduct, and creating relationships becomes core. And so creating relationships with athletes, but also creating relationships with their family and within the community, because oftentimes the volunteer youth sport coach is the individual who connects people within the community. And so being able to do that. And then also creating both positive and inclusive practices, making sure, as Katie mentioned, that those practices are safe, both emotionally as well as physically. And then kind of the nitty-gritty that we often think about in terms of sport coaching, and that is conducting practices and competitions, and how to do that in a way that meets the child where they are. And so conducting those practices appropriately. And then just helping coaches be able to strive for their own improvement. And so looking for ways that they can take care of themselves, but also so how that they can be able to continue to improve their practice. And so those standards sort of set the stage for what parents should expect from youth sport coaches, what administrators should be looking for in youth sport coaches, and what educators and developers should consider in terms of helping coaches really develop and meet those expectations.
Fantastic, Lori. And this is, I always get so excited, right? This is why you guys are all here and this panel is together. It's just such a powerhouse of really thinking about how do we do this in a best practice perspective, informed by so much great energy and great evidence. So I really appreciate getting sort of a perspective from all the different organizations. And as we move forward into some of these other questions, feel free, to jump in and to move around as sort of perhaps suits. The next question I'd like to bring up, which something that I think all of you mentioned in one way or another, is that, that idea of volunteerism, and is any volunteer a good volunteer? So from that perspective, what is an organization's responsibility in seeking quality volunteers? Where do you put that emphasis in an organization's responsibility or the thing that they're supposed to do?
Well, I mean, I would say that that's right up there at the top of the list. The care of our young people is paramount. It's safety is important. What young people get from the experience is important, and so I think that that is right at the top of the list. One of the things that Lori shared that I thought was interesting is like we talk about the standards of coaching. That's something that needs to be clearly communicated to parents as well, so that they know what they're looking for. Quite often, when you think about what happens in a youth sports setting, all parents have to go by oftentimes is whether this program won or not. You know, it's like they won the U9 championship. Now the coach may have run roughshod over all of the players, but you know, so it's important for parents to know what they're looking for. And I think part of, you know, what needs to happen is also coach-parent meetings, so that there's a clear expectation about what the program is, how it's being run, what you can expect from the coach, and the like, so that there aren't any misunderstandings about what's important.
Yeah, Wayne, I think that's really important, is that having that organizational orientation, and it's not only for the coach, but it's also for the parents. And so every page about a mission, right? And so really emphasizing that what we're trying to do is to help kids become better, right? And so back to the comment that was made earlier is that we're really interested in making better people through sport, right? It's at the core of Positive Coaching Alliance in terms of some of the work that they do, right? Is to center that piece. And so, yes, I would agree that that is a critical component.
Yeah, in the National Youth Sports Strategy, we have ideas for recruitment and retention. So to Wayne's point, establishing expectations from jump so that the people who are volunteering know exactly what they are being asked to do. You know, some targeted messages, personal outreach to get the type of coaches that you're looking for. There's also research that youth respond well to coaches who reflect the demographics of the community. So practicing culturally relevant recruiting. And then, you know, a pool of potential volunteers would be those college or even high school athletes themselves who might not only want to give back to the sport and reflect the lessons they've learned immediately, but also might need those community service hours. So a double whammy there. But to the point about is any volunteer a good volunteer, I think the retention strategies, the training support is really important as well for establishing, building, and strengthening those interpersonal relationships between the athletes and coaches. So some of the retention strategies that we have in the National Youth Sports Strategy include, you know, reinforcing the benefits of why they're serving, providing them with the resources and equipment necessary to be successful, offering incentives, but also providing alternate ways to serve if the initial opportunity does not turn out to be the right fit. So maybe somebody volunteered to be a coach, but they're not necessarily reflecting or the values that you want in that particular coach. Is there a different opportunity? Could they be an official? Could they be more of a behind the scenes person, but keeping them engaged because they volunteered for a reason?
And to Allison, to your Allison, to your point too, I think just in terms of the type of volunteer engagement they have. So screening is a really important tool with that in terms of, is this somebody appropriate or comfortable working with youth? They set age appropriate boundaries. So one of the things we really recommend from a screening perspective, in addition to a criminal background check, the U.S. Center for Safe Sport has a centralized disciplinary database. It's free and publicly available. We, through our organization, investigate cases of sexual abuse and misconduct. And so individuals who have been sanctioned for misconduct, those adults are posted on our website. And so we encourage people to also include the layer of screening to make sure that it is someone who is appropriate to work with kids and checking against that database. And so you can go online at uscenterforsafesport.org to look for that. In addition, we recommend training. It's certainly required for those individuals that are affiliated with the Olympic and Paralympic movement in the US. We have training that's available for partners outside of that movement as well, but it really teaches about abuse prevention as well as response. So how do you report a disclosure when a child comes forward and tells you about something that happened? What do you do if an administrator or a coach has perpetrated abuse? How do you make that mandatory report to law enforcement directly to the U.S. Center for Safe Sport? So making sure that people are getting regular training on abuse prevention, Certainly the standards that Lori talked about, it has a lot of those measures in place in terms of making sure those benchmarks are hit for training and screening. And then lastly, I think the monitoring and supervision piece is really important. Sometimes in organizations, we get volunteers and then, you may send them out to go work with kids, but it's really important to make sure that there's that extra level of support so that there's 2 deep leadership. Adults are not left alone interacting with kids, and that when a volunteer starts out coaching, that they're getting that support that they need from the organization. So making sure that they can check back in with you in terms of any questions or concerns that come up, and then being able to observe the interactions that they're having with kids, and provide them with that valuable feedback if you see something that's concerning, and if there's a developmental opportunity to help them grow within their coaching career.
Katie, I completely agree, obviously, with the need for the screening, and we love that is such a free and easily accessible resource for youth sport coaches. It's something that I know we send folks that way a lot in the Olympic lane. But I think one of the other pieces that is important there is that ongoing training is really around best practices, and that it allows a coach to evolve as the career evolves, right? A year 10 volunteer is not the same as that high school kid who wants to give back to the sport. And so from our perspective, not only does the training need to be ongoing, but it needs to evolve with the coach and their needs. And we also really like to give those coaches an opportunity to create this sort of collaborative environment with parents, the athlete, and then their colleagues. And so we would love for organizations to provide opportunities for particularly less experienced coaches to network with other coaches, to have an opportunity to have those conversations. And sometimes those are very anecdotal. Hey, I ran into this issue. What's a best practice for handling that? I think sometimes that we hear from coaches that they feel a little isolated, that they're on an island trying to do this, and they can't talk to their colleagues because it's not like they're paid or compensated coaches. They don't have the same sort of colleague support network. And so we would love to have more of that support available for those volunteer coaches.
Yeah, and I just want to piggyback on that point, because I really think that is an important piece, is that having the quality education for the coaches. And to just come back to where we were before, right, is we were talking about what were the expectations and what sort of experience we wanted to have, wanted youth sport children to have. And we talked about creating these emotionally and physically safe environments, creating a sport environment where the kids had fun and that they engaged in lifelong activity and that they were going to develop life skills. Well, that just doesn't happen just because you participate in sport. It requires the person who's involved in that to make that happen. And that's what's really key about the coach, is that the coach needs to have that training in order to be able to create a safe environment, in order to be able to develop life skills. And how do you integrate that into practice, and how do you reinforce those lessons, and how do you get kids excited about being physically active and building their competence? And so that notion of providing appropriate educational experiences for coaches and also meeting them where they are and helping them develop as they go along, I think is really critical. I think the other piece that I wanted to piggyback on is something Allison said about colleges and students and them participating as volunteers. And I would just advocate as an individual who runs a coaching education program at a college, that it is a great opportunity for us in the educational system of higher education to think about, how can we give back to our communities? And this is one way that we give back to our communities, is by working with local youth sport organizations to provide them with that training that they might need, or to provide them with individuals who volunteer through field experiences or through internships, so that we can have this mutually beneficial relationship where we're mentoring new group of coaches into the field of youth sport, while at the same time helping to support those youth sport organizations that really need volunteers.
Lori, one thing that you just said that I was really struck by, and I think it's important that we take it even one step further, and that is, you said that it doesn't happen on accident, right? This doesn't happen without an intentional plan for it to happen. I think that that level of transparency also needs to extend into our communication with these athletes, right? It isn't just the coach needs to know it's happening. If we're looking at youth sports as an educational tool, the young athletes also need to know that this is an intentional discussion about character. It's values. It's about healthy pursuits. It's about whatever the values that you're hoping, or the character trait that you're hoping to convey through sport. That doesn't happen accidentally there either, right? So it's extending that transparency, not just for the coach to do it intentionally, but to share very transparently with young athletes. Sport is bigger than the X's and O's and the things that are happening on the field.
Yeah, very good point.
I would
We
love
want
to
them
see.
transfer those skills. Yeah, sorry.
Go ahead, Wayne, and then I'll jump in after that. I've got another question for you guys.
No, I was just thinking about, we've been talking about some of the, best practices and so forth, and, the need for training. And I wholeheartedly agree with all of that. And I come back to, there are also some fundamental things that, coaches should be thinking about, organizations and coaches should be thinking about, that doesn't necessarily take a lot of training. And that is, we talked earlier about this youth-centered approach. And a lot of times young people are coming to practice and to games, bringing the stuff of the day, especially today with COVID and all the things that are going on. And I think just some of the practices that we need to be thinking about is, hey, making sure that we're meeting with, and when I say meeting with our athletes, just like really meeting and getting, hey, what's going on? Downloading, if there's something that's bothering them, is there something that happened at school or at home, just so that they can transition from one area, from school or home, to the practice field or gym or whatever it may be. And, for coaches to be prepared with a solid plan, practice plan, knowing exactly what they're doing so that they're not making it up on the fly. And again, just some other basic kinds of things in terms of, reflection at the end of a practice, so that young people can actually take what they've learned, think about what they've learned, and also like really embed it, download it and embed it through some, real reflective process that doesn't take a lot of time. So, I think there are a few things that all coaches can do easily, day to day, replicate that, that make a big difference.
Wayne, I think you raised some really important points there, is that, coaching is really teaching, and we're thinking about how are we helping best prepare our athletes, our students, with all these different life lessons, as well as the physical activity skills. And I think there becomes an interesting point, if we back up a little bit, to tap into some of the different conversation that's been going on here. How do we best support and prepare those teachers, coaches, when they may come from jobs where these aren't the skills, either the skills of working with children, or the skills of what's fundamental physical education look like, or how do I teach someone how to reflect and to do these things? And so I wanted to sort of put this to everybody. We've heard a little bit about the importance of background checks and maybe having them do some, training, whether it be online or in person or those things. But most of our sport organizations are functioning from a business perspective. They have a business model. They are responsible for getting parents in the door, getting the funds, scheduling the fields. And I'd love to hear maybe some perspectives on how can those organizations, what's missing in them, or what do they need, or what have you seen that works well, that helps them pivot from being just a business to also being the educators and supporters of their coaches? Because I think that's what we're sort of starting to dance around a little bit as I'm listening to everybody talk.
Well, I would say that one of the fundamental pieces that may be missing, that would make a difference if it were added, is the whole notion of youth development at the foundation of the experience. And so if we come from that perspective that, we are looking to develop young people, then many of our interactions are quite different. If I'm a high school, former high school athlete or collegiate, or perhaps even played professionally, I may bring that perspective to my U11 team, which is totally inappropriate. And so I just think, the first place really is to think about it from a youth development perspective. And if we begin to bring that, the experiences that young people will have will be so much greater. That will increase the participation, increase the retention, increase parent satisfaction and player satisfaction. And so from a business model perspective, that certainly would make a lot of sense.
Kristen, I think when we've talked a little bit about the ADM and those models of evolving and having a more sort of holistic approach to the whole child in this period, I think that offers some promise. I think that is, when well developed and when integrated carefully and with a lot of great evidence to support it, I think that it doesn't dismiss that experience that a lot of times kids are choosing programs, or their parents are choosing programs based on word of mouth and who's had a great experience in a particular program. And I think that Wayne makes an excellent point here. If we can marry the concept of athletic success on the field alongside the human success of building great people, that experience does become more positive. It does have the word of mouth advertising piece that the business model requires. And I think that there is a happy medium in there.
Yeah, and
oh, go ahead.
I think the point we're trying to get through is that we want quality coaching so that we have quality programming so kids will actually be able to reap the benefits of sport participation. And so, quality training will help support that chain of events. And, there are wonderful partners like you all and other organizations to help support that. We have a whole list of, I think up to 20 training topics that, quality coaches are skilled in. So there are a lot of opportunities, but potentially, considering certification or licensing of coaches can help to elevate that quality. And like I mentioned, there are a bunch of organizations that can support that for organizations.
Yeah, and I want to come back to, I think, Wayne, you may have made this point earlier on when we were talking about volunteers don't have a lot of time to give, but they give time to the organization. Or Kristen, you may have mentioned that as well. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit about, I am in total agreement as a coach educator that it's really important that we educate the volunteers and that they play a role. But I think at a lot of youth sport organizations, I'm not necessarily convinced that they should do all the heavy lifting. That we're asking a lot of them to just come in and be with the athletes. And I'm wondering if what those volunteers should do is to really focus on the how to coach rather than the what to coach. And so as we think about this, I'm wondering if youth sport administrators really should be creating those season plans and those daily practice plans that lay out the long-term athlete development piece. And so that the youth sport coach is just provided that material, and that the organization sets the schedule, sets up the competition sites, organizes the officials. But what the youth sport coach is there to do is to make connections, to help teach life skills and other physical skills, and that the role of the administrator is to help guide them through that process, and then maybe even embrace a role as a coach developer. We're talking about helping the volunteer as they continue through this process and to become a better coach, is that they would go out and observe coaches in action as they're organizing practices and maybe give them tips about how to give better feedback to the athletes, or how to keep the kids active the whole time so that we can have more physical activity during a practice session, or how to give more focused instruction, or how to use a games-based approach, all those best practices that are really part of how you do the coaching piece, rather than the kind of the X's and O's and putting together that big picture. And so I really think that we should begin to start to ask youth sport organizations to do a little bit more heavy lifting to help guide those coaches along the way on their path towards being able to provide a quality sport experiences for young people.
Laura, I think that's a starting point for conversation when we talk about how to support this systemically and not as an individual sports organization trying to figure this out. We have a partnership right now with USA Football, and they're doing just that. And it's a really, really smart model that they have in place. They have built the practice plans for their volunteer coaches. They're utilizing some of our training modules and some of our lessons to plug in those pieces. And so a volunteer coach receives a packet that says, week 1, you're going to talk about accountability, and here's the way we're going to do it. Here's how you're going to integrate it into practice. Here's the reflective piece at the end. Here's what you're going to send home to the parents. There's all these layers of engagement, and the volunteer coach is not responsible for creating any of that. They have been trained ahead of time. They've received training, and then they just have to go do it. And I think that is a really smart conversation, because you're right. The volunteer coaches are being generous and giving of their time, but it's unlikely that they're going to have 20 hours a week to devote to training and prepping and building their practice plans. And I think it's a really interesting approach if that could be more systemic.
Well, it
and I will just plug. Oh, go ahead, Wayne.
No, I was just you can get your plug in. I would just say that it has to be, if coaching if we elevate coaching, we have to do it in a systemic type way. So that means that there is some baseline for the engagement that has to happen at some organizational or at some governing body type level that then gets cascaded. So again, that's all that I've got to say about that.
Yeah, and I like that idea as well, because the thing that I was thinking about, one, I was just going to plug that I think First Tee with PGA does the same sort of thing, right? Is that they provide that material. But I think that what we may be missing in youth sport organizations is sort of a tiered approach, that maybe we have some coaches that are in these developmental positions where they are creating these plans and they're leading these other youth volunteers. And so that there's that tiered level that we create the professional coach who has had more experience engaged in coaching, can spend more time in a paid position doing the development of these plans and going out and observing coaches, and then have that youth volunteer group that will then be able to do some of the how-tos of regular practice. And so maybe even revisiting how youth sport organizations structure in that way as well.
Yeah. And I think too, like you've all talked about in terms of removing those barriers for youth sport coaches to just get involved and do what they love to do. And so I think part of that too is asking them as part of the onboarding process when they get started, what is it about volunteering that's really meaningful to you? For some youth sport coaches and volunteers, it may be that they want to go on to professional coaching. And so they're really interested in more development and growth. And so really tailoring the plan of, modeling, mentorship opportunities, getting to see really great coaching in action. Because I think it's really hard to find volunteer coaches, but it's really important that we retain the good volunteer coaches that we get in the door. And so really just asking them, what is it about this opportunity that is important to them, and then structuring it around how we can remove some of those barriers for them, provide that open avenue for consultation and support, just to help them as they grow. They may only be volunteering for this year. They're a dad in the sport that wants to be part of their child's team, or it may be somebody who's just starting on this path, gets to meet the organization, is really amazed by all the wonderful things that y'all are doing, and they want to continue in the field. And so we want to foster that development for them.
And I do want to put in one note about the notion of opening up the volunteer pool. Quite often the person that's the volunteer coach happens to be dad, whose son or daughter is playing, and somehow mom becomes the team mom quite often. And, quite frankly, I think that we need to be looking beyond gender as well to ensure that mothers are involved and women are involved in the coaching process, that, women bring a whole different kind of flavor to the experience. And quite frankly, as we look to have more girls participating in sport, it was someone who said earlier that it's important that, the coaches look like the participants. And so, little girls also need to see, women in those type, and boys do too, but girls need to see women in those positions. So I think that it's important for us to, open up the pool, to look to women, get past some of the stereotypical roles that may be in the coaching domain.
As a mom hockey coach, I really, really appreciate that, especially working with the smallest kids on ice. And it is an amazing experience as a mom out on ice. But you all bring up some really interesting points that I wanted to sort of pick up and see where we could go with them a little bit. Certainly Michael Krieger, who's at USA Football, has done an amazing job. He's a teacher by training with an incredible background that has created a teach the teacher model. And they've actually started to talk about that person in the organization that is going to develop and support the other volunteer coaches, and they get a little more training, sort of to that tiered system that Lori's starting to talk about, of in your organization starting to do that and moving away from a administrative only with our volunteer coaches. And you guys have started to talk about the two separate paths of both getting volunteers in, keeping volunteers or retaining those who want to stay in the system, but also then handling it when we see challenges or problems, so that as we've raised the expectation bar, how are we upholding that? And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to, Katie, you started to, with the concerns about, when we have the egregious sexual abuse, but we also have issues around just people who maybe not be the best with children or don't quite have the skills or the style that would be appropriate for working with kids. I wonder if you could speak a little bit to that vein of, what do we do when the expectations aren't being met?
Yeah, so I think, when the expectations are being met, I think we need to get really comfortable with providing that feedback and to say, you know what, this is an appropriate fit. This is not an appropriate fit for you. And so, one of the things that we're developing at the center is just some additional training and some resources like a coach's toolkit that's going to be released next year around emotional and physical abuse and misconduct. So that the name calling when it crosses the line from discipline to abuse, making sure it's really clear for coaches at identifying other coaches' behavior, and then having the skills and tools to be someone who intervenes. So when you see that behavior, you hear something that's not appropriate, that you're gonna say something. It could be that you use a variety of different tactics to do that, but knowing that there's resources to intervene yourself on the field when you see that happening, or pulling them aside afterwards. But that also, there's another layer of support in terms of where to report that abuse, because that's a critical piece to have in place. We hear a lot of times that, people didn't know that they were a mandatory reporter when they see something happening. And so making sure that the people have those tools, they know where to go, what to do. And they also have somebody to talk to if it's the first time that they have to make a report, knowing that they've got other people to call on to help them through that process. And so we're going to be releasing some other tools too, just around mandatory reporting, when you make that phone call, how you do that, and just providing additional layers of support for coaches.
Yeah, so I also think that it gets to what's the level of, what's the specific issue that comes up with a coach. It could be that it's a matter of feedback and training and feedback. For many of us in everyday life, we have our blind spots, and if it's just a matter of that, it's a matter of, I think, bringing those issues to the coach's attention, and looking to have on the spot development. Again, if it's something that's much more egregious, then much more severe action needs to be taken. So again, I think it also just depends on what the level is involved in. And I think also we need to have some end of season feedback. And I'm going to tell you, at the end of the day, and when they make me czar for the day, one of the things that I'll be doing is having a feedback system where parents and players can provide feedback on coaches as a development opportunity for them, but also as a means of really letting others know the quality of coaches. So stay tuned for SAR for the day.
I think when we talk about retaining great coaches, I think we also need to think about the organization's role in protecting those great volunteer coaches we do have an overzealous parent, or we have, because certainly coaches have an elevated responsibility to do what is right for those children and to be well trained and to be executing in a professional and appropriate way. But I think that anyone who's been to a youth sporting event in the last 10 to 15 years has seen spectators not return the favor and not be appropriate on the sidelines. And so I think if we want to retain great volunteers, we have to have some protections in place that give them an outlet or a place to receive some guidance or some help when they are in that situation, because I think we see it certainly with officials, but coaches as well receive an awful lot of harassment from armed quarterback parents in the sidelines. And so I think, I think that's a part of the retention piece, because nobody wants to volunteer their time and have negative interactions with other parents on the sidelines.
Yeah, so just a couple quick thoughts about that. You're absolutely right. As I think about one best practice or one promising practice, really is, a parent volunteer in the stands that's accountable for, from each team, that's accountable for managing behavior of parents that are out of line. And that gets to parents having ownership and dealing with their peers in a way that's appropriate. The other thing that's top of mind is, quite often, parents may be overzealous because, again, of coming back to lack of understanding of what expectations are. And so if I think my kid should be playing more, and that didn't get covered in some preseason meeting about what the philosophy of the program is and playing time and all of that, then that sets up those kinds of things to occur. So again, comes back to support from the organization around setting expectations, support to parents so that they don't have to bear the brunt of those kind of things that happen because of just human interaction, human nature.
Yeah, and I think it also speaks to just the culture of youth sport in the United States in particular, but I think internationally as well, is that this belief that by participating in youth sport, it sets you on a track towards being able to compete at a higher and higher level, right? And that you need to start early on, and that if you don't get certain experiences by certain times, and that if a coach isn't helping you get those experiences, you're not going to end up with a college scholarship or being in a professional program. And so we really need to help shift what is the culture of youth sport? What is the expectation of youth sport? Is that it's not necessarily about this elite model of getting to that high level, but for a large majority, 98% or more of the children involved, it's about having an experience that will lead to physical literacy, right? That will lead to them being competent and enjoying physical activity, learning those life lessons to engage in that activity for a lifetime. And so really helping to shift that and helping parents see that. And so breaking down some of the business models that focus in on the promise of moving in that direction, right? And then the expectation that parents have. And so it's back to transparency, it's back to expectation.
I think those are all some really, really powerful words as we start to think about, as we've been talking about, an organization needing to have clear vision, clear expectations, and to be able to articulate those very well. And as Wayne said earlier, parents and athletes need to understand what that vision is. They need to have that clear idea of what is their athlete development model from a holistic perspective, and be very clear on that so that can then be imparted to the coaches and then be supported in how the coaches are acting in their behaviors and their skills and the things they're doing to make sure the environment gives that to the athletes. So there's a whole systemic thing that I'm sort of hearing everybody talk about. And it sort of leads me to wonder a little bit. Katie, you certainly talked a little bit about the resources that the U.S. Center for Safe Sport has started to develop. But thinking about most of our organizations, particularly in our youth sports space, what is it that they should be developing internally and delivering? Because when we say we or they should, what exactly should they have? And what can they outsource and bring in and in the outsourcing and bringing in, what are your recommendations for vetting that material so that it is, Wayne, you used a term a second ago I really liked, and I didn't write it down, promising practice, I think. And I really like that term. I'm going to steal it. What would be your recommendations for organizations to take on that responsibility of being the educators and the defenders and the supporters of their coaches in defense and support of their mission towards development?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. And you know, one of the things that we're doing at the National Council of Youth Sports, we're grappling with that issue. So one, we know that there are lots of resources that are out there. You know, that's sort of the challenge of where we are today. So many resources that in so many different places that it's hard to know what makes the most sense. One of the things that we're looking to do is to begin to do some asset mapping, if you will, and taking a look at what are those resources in a variety of ways from a coaching perspective, and then begin to think about what's the most appropriate way to begin to vet to determine which ones make the most sense. And so, you know, this is a process that we're going to be going through over the next year, and it's our hopes that as we connect in with all of you all, that collectively we'll come to a place where, you know, we can identify what are the most appropriate things that should be in a training, what are the most appropriate things that should be in a resource, so that we can, as we point organizations to resources, we can say these are the ones that you should be looking for.
I think that's right. There is an abundance of terrific information out there, and it is, I think, probably the largest challenge ahead. It would be to sort through and to catalog that. So I don't envy that role for you, Wayne. But I do think that there would be some minimum standards that an organization would want to look for, right? I think number one, you would want to make sure that the resources that you're providing your coaches are authentically representing your organization's values and approach. I don't think that we can hope to make any change in any of the culture pieces or any of the interactions that we've talked about today if it is done purely to check a box. Like, it really must be authentic and genuine to the desire and the vision of that organization. And then I think making sure that those resources are as up to date as possible, that they've been vetted for, you know, that they are backed by evidence, that they are driven by expert information, that it is not, I think, watered down in any way, because our kids deserve to have the best evidence-based practices in place. And I think those two for me are big ones, is making sure that it's authentic and genuinely aligned with the organization, and two, that the resources you're relying upon are driven by the science of making, you know, kids' lives better.
Yeah, and I will follow up with that, Jennifer, in regards to looking at the evidence-based practice piece. And so the national standards for sport coaches are based on the current coaching science and evidence-based practice in the field. And one of the things that we're doing at the United States Center for Coaching Excellence in the area of accreditation is that we accredit programs who are basing their curriculum on the national standards for sport coaches. And so there are programs that are already doing that. One of the things that we've just rolled out is what's called a recognition. And so that programs that are currently doing education in particular areas of the core responsibilities. So for example, an organization that's focused in on ethical practice, that they are going to focus in their program on that core responsibility associated with the national standards. And then what we would do at the USCCE is that we would go ahead and externally evaluate that and determine whether it meets best practice standards. And so we're setting up programs to do just what you're talking about, is that trying to encourage programs to reach out to us, and that we will do that external validation to suggest that they meet those particular standards in terms of best practices.
And I'll just add, if any of the organizations watching are looking for a roadmap or a starting point, the National Youth Sports Strategy was developed as a federal roadmap to unite U.S. youth sports culture around the shared vision that one day all youth will have the opportunity, motivation, and access to play sports regardless of their race, ethnicity, sex, ability, or zip code. So please check that out on health.gov. And additionally, I mentioned earlier that the Science Board will be submitting their report to the President's Council on Sports, Fitness, and Nutrition, as well as a fact sheet on the benefits of youth sports. So these are great resources that will be posted on health.gov as well, that organizations can use to promote or make the case for youth sports programming moving forward. And registration for that annual meeting is open to the public on health.gov as well. So there's my shameless plugs, but we're here for you. We're the US government, everything we create is for you for free. So please use it.
You know, Allison, that's actually really brilliant, because that's exactly, we've just got a few more minutes and I wanted to give everybody an opportunity. You know, this group of organizations was chose for this panel and this presentation because you are in some way, shape, or form in the United States, one of the leading organizations that's dealing in the youth sports space and helping support this movement, this collective movement forward towards making it a better, safer, healthier space for all of our kids. And certainly this is part of the SIGA Sport Integrity Week, because SIGA, of course, is working on this youth protection and development guidelines for organizations to help them choose best practices. But I wanted to give everybody an opportunity to, as we wrap it up here, is there something else you'd like to say about your organization, your leadership space, or this conversation about raising the bar in support of youth sport coaching? I'll give you guys a moment to, whatever else is on your mind, to sum it up.
First, I would just say thank you for the important work that you do every day supporting those youth coach volunteers that are out there. It is such an important job. So thank you for what they do and what you do. And lastly, you do not need to reinvent the wheel. So at U.S. Center for Safe Sport, we have model policies, so code of conduct, as well as minor athlete abuse prevention policies. You are welcome to take those and use those wherever you're at. If you have any questions for us, we're happy to continue the conversation. And so if we can be a resource for you, just reach out. Lastly, we have free parent and youth training. And so the youth training is at different age appropriate and developmental levels. And so encourage people sharing those resources. And then the last plug is that we are going to be launching a volunteer course for coaches in 2021. So this will be a shorter course, really meeting the needs of youth coaches and volunteers out there. So just thank you again for your important work.
I'd like to add thanks again, Kristen, for the invitation to participate. I think it's always nice to get in a room, virtually or otherwise, with folks who are doing great work in this space. It's inspiring to our team, I know. And we would also invite anyone who wants to engage in that conversation about the character and life skills that are learned through sport. That's really where True Sports heart is, and we have terrific resources available. Check us out at truesport.org. Certainly follow us on social, but we are always looking for ways to better communicate with parents and those volunteer coaches in particular. So join the conversation with us, we'd appreciate it.
And I would just say,
Go ahead, Alice.
okay, so I would just say for the U.S. Center for Coaching Excellence is that our role is really to help individuals who are interested in being coach educators and coach developers to do that quality coach education and development for their coaches at every level. And so feel free to reach out to us in terms of resources. Our role is to really help to reframe the system of how we train and educate coaches. And so willing to help out in regards to that, because very interested in shifting that and really building the profession of coaching and developing minimal standards for coaches.
We need your voice, Wayne. We almost made it.
Thank you. Again, at the National Council of Youth Sport, we've got three things that we're interested in: being an advocate for youth sports and youth sport organizations, educating our membership, but also the general public about the importance of youth sports, and then finally, connecting our members to products, services, tools that make a difference for them. I do want to make a plug for someone who is not here. Dr. Amanda Visick with George Washington School of Public Health. She's done what she calls the fun maps. And I just want to end on this notion of fun, because we need to talk about fun more as it relates to youth sports. And, she's done a lot of research around what makes the youth sport experience fun for young people. And it will surprise you, some of the things that are on the list that we think would be high, which really isn't, like winning and all of those things, and all of the other things that may not necessarily be top of mind, like really being complimented by your coach, that are really top of mind. So again, I want to give her a shout out and a plug.
Fantastic. Well, thank you everybody for being a part of this panel. Allison, Wayne, Jennifer, Katie, Lori, just really powerful stuff and really important stuff. And I look forward to seeing what you're going to be doing as we move into 2021. So thank you everyone again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.